Welcome to this week's virtual charla brought to you by the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, LULAC, Prospanica, DC and LA, MALDEF, and CHCI. I'm Antonio Tijerino of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, and today's charla is titled #Free Our Children, and we want to discuss the current state of our children and families at the border from the perspectives of leaders and activists in the refugee, migrant, asylum space. I've been close to this issue for many, many years, but have had a really hard time following and focusing on the issue, considering what we can actually do to improve this situation, what are new policies, how it's changed, it's kind of gotten out of the news cycle, and what are the processes for our sacred and valued children and families at the border. Besides voting with our American values, of course, it's critical we vote, especially voting with our values, and that's one way. But what are those other ways that we can take action, as well as also raise the awareness and continue to shine the light? We have the privilege to screen a 9-minute film, Mirage, which is a magic realism tale about a girl who spends her time daydreaming and fantasizing and hopes to be reunited with her parents as she is held captive by US border agents. The director of the film, Ramon Quintero, will be on today's charla along with compadres and comadres who inspire me and the work of our organization every day. We are joined by Sister Norma Pimentel of Catholic Charities, Tom Sands of MALDEF, Cindy Benavides of LULAC, and Krish Omara Vignaraja of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Charlers are weekly virtual interactions led by our community to talk, listen, and discuss our experiences, ideas, actions, issues, and resources through a series of compelling and inspiring presentations based on themes important to our community. This is a different twist on it because we have a group of speakers, but today's charla is that important because I read recently that immigration is now the 12th most important issue to Americans. That's alarming. As my friend and one of my advisors on immigration issues, Cesar Moreno, said, we can't forget human casualty and forgotten voices, the children and families who continue to suffer in silence. We need to make noise, and that's why we're doing this charla. So let's start with the man who got this started, and we'll get this charla started today. I've always said that as activists, it's not about us. It's not about you. It's about the call you answer and the call you make to drive awareness, collaboration, and action. So I want to thank Jimmy Ortiz, as well as Cindy, Omaira, Jesus, Luis, and all the panelists, and all of you participating in this charla for calling and answering these calls to help the most vulnerable in our community. With that, please welcome Jimmy Ortiz, who is the President Emeritus of Prospanica, DC, to say a few words about today's charla. Jimmy?
Hi, Tony, y buenas tardes a todos. I mean, I'm so excited to be here today and to be able to talk to you about this important issue. Prospanica's mission is to empower and enable Hispanic MBAs and business professionals to achieve their full educational, economic, and social potential. But with the recent developments around our country, our close to 50 chapters around the nation, and including Puerto Rico, and with the support of our CEO, Tomas Sabino, have become more socially conscious about what's going on. That's why when Omaira Jesus, the president from our LA chapter, introduced me to this film, the first thing I thought was, we need a platform to present it. Immediately, I reached out to Cindy from LULAC and Tony, and as usual, the HHF award-deserving team came through. Speaking of awards, in collaboration with LA and the Columbus chapters, on October 15, we will be celebrating the Hispanic Heritage Month Comunidad Award. And I found out earlier this afternoon that the HHF team has been nominated for the DC Organization Comunidad Award for their Charla series. So please follow Prospanica via our social media platforms for more information about this and other local and national events, including our national conference next month. Thank you, Tony, and back to you. Congratulations on the nomination.
That's fantastic, and believe me, my team deserves it. Thank you, Jimmy. And I just have to say, too, I always appreciate our Puerto Rican familia standing with our immigrant community. That's a lot of heart. And so I want to thank you, Jimmy, for championing all these issues. And now let's take a breath and watch this powerful short film exclusively screened for all of you called Mirage by Luis Quintero, and it'll be about 9 minutes. Thank you for that beautiful film, Luis. Thank you for continuing to tell the stories of our journeys in such a compassionate way. And thank you for joining our Charla today. I look forward to hearing from you in a few moments, along with your fellow Charla panelists. Also, I just want to make sure that everyone, I see a lot of the chat boxes being utilized. Please, we encourage you to cheer on or highlight a point or even disagree with a point or add to it in the chat box. So please make sure to do that. Just don't do it so it's just for panelists. Make sure that it's for everyone. And all of the panelists, if you could make sure your cameras are on and you're off mute, that would be great. So joining Luis on the panel are, let me start with my friend, Krish Omara Vignaraja, who is the CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, who was a refugee from Sri Lanka, and has also, I just want to say on a personal note, beyond what she does professionally, she has bravely detailed her current battle with breast cancer publicly to help other women who are or might be dealing with that situation. So you're an inspiration, Krish, and thank you for doing that. I also want to welcome mi hermana, Cindy Benavides, CEO of LULAC, who has sore knuckles from La Lucha since she took over LULAC. And we count on her for so many battles, including fighting on behalf of our familia at the border. Speaking of the border, she's been called the angel at the border and has been trying to teach me how to have more grace for many years. Please welcome Sister Norma Pimentel, Executive Director of Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley. And lastly, our campeón, a leading voice for our community, one of the most brilliant minds in this space that I've ever seen, Tom Sands, President and General Counsel of MALDEF, a fierce fighter on behalf of our community. So I'd like to start off with a question for Luis about the film we just saw, since it's fresh in our minds. Luis, tell us very quickly about Mirage and what inspired you to take this unique angle in telling the story of our migrant journeys, as well as elaborate on the symbolism you used in the beginning of the film.
Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank everyone, HHF, LULAC, CHCI, LRR, MALDEF, Prospanica, Los Angeles, and DC for putting this charla together. You know, we're thrilled to be here, but saddened at the same time. Thrilled because I get to share the stage with such amazing panelists, but also sad because of the subject matter. And it is a shame that, you know, criminals are being released daily, but yet innocent children still remain incarcerated. You know, so that was the main motivation behind it. And I'm glad that you mentioned the layers and the symbolism behind it, because just how this little poster behind me of her, you know, banded eyes, it's representative of Lady Justice. And, you know, I love the United States and I love what we stand for, but certain things are, I feel, bad decisions, you know what I mean? And we should be here to inspire our children and not keep them locked up. Yeah. So what represents at the beginning is just more of when most people see children, they think that they don't know any better and they're still growing. But for example, I have a 4-year-old niece who's way smarter than I am, and she's always paying attention, and the 2-year-old is also catching up very quickly. And they're observant and they see everything, and they're, you know, stronger than we realize. So the first time you see the film, you think it's just parents giving an affirmation to twin sisters and letting them know about, you know, encouragement, grow and be respectful, and you're stronger than you realize. But when you watch it again at the very end, it's showing her that you need to have this courage, and there really isn't twins, it's actually just one individual, and she needs to rely on herself, and all those teachings that the parents gave them are affirmations for them to, or for her to go through these troubling times. And that's the reason why she blindfolds herself, because in a way, there's no manual for life. It's just, we're kind of going by, you know, a gut instinct that we have. And it's, in a way, you're being guided by the blind.
Thank you, Luis. And can you talk also briefly about how important it is now more than ever to produce socially conscious films such as Mirage to bring awareness to issues that many Americans and members of our own community lose sight of because of quick news cycles and other tragedies that are happening around us, whether it's fires, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the social unrest. There's a lot for us to look at right now, but we can't lose sight of what is happening on our border.
Absolutely. You know, my beginnings, I started about 19 years ago in the film industry. I worked for Universal, Disney, Sony, Fox, because I wanted to understand how this machine works. I personally feel that if you want to learn how this works, be a part of it. Be surrounded by the people you want to be like. And after a few years, I said, well, do I have any talent to actually showcase? Because sometimes learning is one thing, but putting it into practice is another. And the one observation that I've noticed is that movies don't make films about this. I mean, yes, there's some films that are out there and they're far few in between, but they're the exception, not the rules. The studio system finances more Marvel movies. This is why you've been seeing for the last 10 years, superhero movies. And the issue with that is that films like Mirage get lost in the shuffle. So I made it a point to say, use my voice as, as an artist to elevate or shed a light onto this, because otherwise we live in an oversaturated market. I used to be the kind of filmmaker that wanted to have my film play at the theater and 4K resolution and Atmos surround sound, and but then I realized, who cares if no one sees it? And we're not going to have the marketing dollars that a Marvel movie is going to have. So that's why I'm very grateful for platforms like this, because it gives us a voice and it connects us to the community leaders and the panelists that are going to follow, in this panel, because we don't have, we're not saying we have the answers, but we do have a purpose. And when you bring like-minded people together, maybe even an audience member may say, hey, I have a great idea. And, this is why, maybe we keep in contact, so I strive for everything that I do to bring social consciousness.
Well, thank you, Luis. And we're here for you, so we appreciate that. So to the other panelists, can we start with just the current state of the border from your own perspectives? But know that my next question is going to be the impact of the pandemic. So don't go deep into that area. So let me start with Sister Norma from your perspective, and please add to this. But I just remember, where are people now? I mean, I remember visiting you over the years, and there would be like 500 to 1,000 people a day showing up at your respite center in McAllen, Texas, looking for shelter, food, clothes, guidance, and comfort. But now it seems that they're intense, and every time I'm texting you, you're always in Matamoros on the other side of the border. So can you talk to us a little bit about what's going on the ground?
Yes, Antonio, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you and share this, what I see and what I'm doing and what is happening here at the border. I just came from over there. I was there all morning, and it's so sad to see how the situation right now is so unfair and so desperate for the families. They're scared, they're frightened. They can't come into the United States and continue their process, so they're just there waiting. And many of the families have dared to cross the river out of desperation. Many of them have been found dead and drowned, and others, the whole criminal element, our organized crime, or have taken over the camp and has really exploited the families and the children. Young girls are at danger of being just taken and raped, and it's so sad to see what is happening today to the refugees right here at the border, and with no relief to be able to find a safer space because they can't go back home. They're not safe back home. And Mexico is very unsafe. Just yesterday we had the whole border blocked by the cartel and by these military state police, and they were firing at each other right downtown, right there by the border, by the camp, and everybody's scared and frightened, and yet they're still there, and we're putting them there in that space that is so unsafe and so terrible. These are women and children, babies and mothers that are frightened, and they tell me, por favor, sáquenme de aquí. That's what I'm seeing, Antonio, and it's terrible.
Sister, can you just talk a little more about, because I've been to your respite center, and I know we took a trip and went to the other side of the border and saw some of the work that was being done there. But are they literally in tents where you're just going from tent to tent? Are they? I know at one point you said people were under bridges and on the street.
Antonio, they are literally on tents, one after another, all piled up. Taking spaces right by the riverbank. It used to be a park for the city of Matamoros, and that's where they are, right next to the river. And so they're exposed to so many problems that surface because they're by the river. We just recently had a hurricane and the water over flooded the river, and half of the camp was underwater, and it was terrible. And now with that river brings rats and snakes and trillions of mosquitoes just invading the spaces, and you see them all suffering from all of this. And they're right there, and the tents are just collapsed because of the continuous rain that we're in the rainy season, and all these storms in the Gulf are just causing rains to happen every single day. And so it's one after another, their tents collapse, and they say, Madrecita, necesitamos más carpas, necesitamos más lonas, and ayúdenos con los mosquitos. You know, it's so bad, the conditions that they're having to deal with. And then plus all of that, the fear of those folks, those people that are evil and bad, and they're just after them and hurting them, and it's terrible.
Sister, can you give us really quickly, if you have even an Amazon page or something where people can go on there and send you mosquito repellent or, you know, food? I know women's sanitary products was always really important for people
yes,
to have.
Yes, definitely. You know, you go to CatholicCharities.rgb.org, you will find our webpage, and I'm sure there's a link there to how to bring us anything that you want us forward to us, either through Amazon or just directly to our address. You know, we'll be happy. Just go CatholicCharities.rgb.org, and you can reach out to us, call us directly, and call my cell 956-455-1484, and I will make sure that if you want to help these families, they will get the help from you. Okay.
Thank you, sister. Let's go to Tom. Tom, I'm very interested in this. Can you talk about the legal aspects of this crisis now, and how many don't even have the opportunity to claim asylum, which is a legal right according to international law, as well as things like MPP, the migrant protection protocols, and how that has changed things, and some of these other issues like I've read about, where you now have to go to another country where you would be sent to instead of going to the United States. So can you talk about some of the legal aspects of this and how it's changed?
I think what you described is the degradation of our law with respect to the protection of refugees from our hemisphere. We have seen this administration impose some of these changes that really effectively prevent, by delay, by misdirection, by putting in place these new legal doctrines, really prevent folks who are clearly fleeing the most dangerous of situations, and in that flight are putting themselves through journeys that are treacherous, that are life-threatening, and then they get to our border and they face today very severe obstacles to obtaining the relief that they would be entitled to under international law, that they would be entitled to under our law even as applied 4 years ago. But I don't want to say that this is entirely a product of this administration. The fact is, and this is an ongoing flaw, that the border in our law, I say our law because it is our United States law that so many people don't understand, but the border has always been a huge obstacle to providing rights to people, because we establish in our law a hierarchy of rights holders, and at the bottom of that hierarchy are people who have never been inside the United States. Anyone who's approaching our border, whether they're doing that on a land border or approaching our border through air flight or through the sea, the fact is we do not accord what most of us would conceive of as necessary human rights to people who have not yet entered our country. So we do not, under our law, and never have, treated them with the same dignity, with the same rights that we provide to people who have been inside of our country. And that's in whatever status. It's a hierarchy. So if you are undocumented, you are obviously going to have under our laws, unfortunately, very few rights. But even lower in that hierarchy of rights holders are those who have never entered our country. And in that sense, you asked the state of the border today, and you've heard from Sister Norma the day-to-day, really wrenching humanitarian emergency that we face at the border. But in terms of the law, the border is as it always has been, which is this really deep and severe barrier to providing rights to human beings, including children.
Can you talk a little bit, Tom, about things like MPP and to explain to people what is happening right now under our noses as we're dealing with other distracting crises and other issues like the one I mentioned where you have to go to a third country as opposed to the United States?
So what I think you heard Sister Norma describe is a situation created because of these new policies that basically require people not to enter the United States while they are right, and I use the term right in quotes because I'm not sure it amounts to a right the way it's enforced, but while their right to asylum is being adjudicated, at least initially, by administrative authorities at the border. So that means that folks are left in Mexico with the dangerous conditions that Sister Norma has described, instead of being allowed to enter the United States while the entire adjudication process beginning to end of their right to claim asylum in our country. You've also talked about safe third country, which is an attempt by this administration to assert that these refugees have gone through safe third countries and therefore under international law should be required to remain in those safe third countries instead of coming to the United States. It's basically a denial of the fact that the countries that folks are traveling through are really very dangerous, particularly for refugees, because of the violence that Sister Norma has described. So we have basically increased, and I say increased because, as I said, this is a flaw in our laws that goes back many, many, many years, but we've increased our laws' willful ignorance about the true context and the true facts on the ground that are faced by refugees. And I emphasize particularly, if not exclusively, refugees from our own hemisphere, because we have always treated refugees from the Americas dramatically differently from refugees that come from other parts of the world. We don't even accord them the label refugees. We label them potential asylees, and we put these obstacles that you described in front of them.
Thank you, Tom. Let me ask Cindy, because Cindy, you were actually one of those kids when you came from Honduras. Can you talk about the activism you're leading through LULAC and what you're doing through the leaders at your chapters and nationally, as well as locally on a grassroots state and federal level on behalf of our families and children at the border?
Primero que nada, Antonio, thank you so much for your leadership. And Luis, thank you for making the invisible visible. We need this now more than ever. And, you know, before I go there, Antonio, I would say that at the very core of what we see with our children and families is this right to a better way of life. And what we fail to understand sometimes as Americans and as people living in the United States, it's that they are living in failed states where US foreign policy has played a major role in constructing the situations that we see today in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Mexico, and across Latin America. And I think there's also this question about accountability. And the fact is that when you see individuals in Central America, and I can speak for mis compatriotas de Honduras, where I have been, where I've had family kidnapped, where I've had family killed, the fact that you have individuals who trust the drug lords more than they trust the military and the police is a statement in its own in terms of what is happening in these communities. And I will tell you that, you know, we came to the US in the 1980s. I was brought by my mother at the age of 1 and my 2-year-old brother. And at that time, the US government did not separate families and children. They kept us together and they released us together as a family unit into the community. And it is a shame that what our children and what we have inherited is a structure that is completely unfair, a structure that is based on a social political construction of racism, to Tom's point. We do see those nuances where our children and our parents and people coming from Latin America and coming from Haiti are treated very different than European immigrants or Canadian immigrants. So let's really have an honest conversation here. This is racism sanctioned by the US government being played at the border. And the fact is that what Sister Norma is, you know, it's saying in terms of what she sees day to day, you have individuals who absolutely qualify for asylum because they are being persecuted. And the fact that the US is failing them and letting them even come in for an interview, we are sending people to their every single day by our own policies. And I just, you know, for the individuals tuning in, Tony, you know, we have to remember que el pueblo se encarga de parar al gobierno. That every single one of us has a role in making sure that we put a stop to what the US government is saying. And we know this is not the first time. We know that there were Japanese internment camps, and we know that this happened to our Native American community and an African American community when they were brought over as slaves. This is not the first time that we see separation of children and families. And I think for us, it's so important that as individuals and as leaders, we take action, that we make the invisible visible. Because if we don't speak up, if we don't highlight this issue, nobody else will. And I speak so forcefully, Antonio, because I'm so passionate about this issue. It literally brings me to tears every single time, thinking of what the children will experience for the rest of their lives being in these detention centers.
I appreciate you, Cindy. You touch my heart every time I hear you take these stances, and that's why we need your leadership. It's heartfelt too, because you were one of those kids. So you've seen that whole process from a view that many people haven't. So Krish, can you actually talk about LIRS, how it's adapting to these new policies to provide on-the-ground care, direct service? But also I think it's important for us to get a perspective that for every Cindy on our border, that there are Krishes all over the world. So what is that global look at the border, not just on our side of the country?
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for highlighting these issues, because I do think even mentioning how immigration has fallen in terms of the interest in it is precisely why charlas that focus on this issue are so critically important. I think the most important thing that LRS tries to convey is that protecting children and families is not at odds with protecting our border. And I think that, you know, right now what we see is inhumane policies that don't seem to recognize a certain constituency as human beings, right? That is at root what our policies have done. They have dehumanized you know, people at our southern border, but we do see it all across the world. So, you know, part of what we're seeing and what we're working on is recognizing that, you know, it is obviously a man-made crisis, thanks to the administration and its policies at our southern border. But even with all of the avenues to come into the US, refugee resettlement is completely closed now, in the sense that it has a very limited trickle right now. But the president needs to sign by the end of this month a presidential determination. A refugee resettlement once again will be suspended. And just yesterday, there was a political article that will be the administration's policy. We have seen seen, as has been mentioned, summarily rejections at the border. When it comes to children, which is our particular focus, we know that Customs and Border Patrol has at least publicly admitted to expelling at least 2,175 minors between March and June. But we know that that is a huge underestimation of what it is. We know it is actually at least hundreds, if not thousands, higher than that. We also know that even for those lucky few who come into the country, we don't treat them as human beings or with decency. You see that with the shadow immigration system that's been set up, where individuals weren't even given a registration number. They were held by basically Beltway bandits, government contractors, in hotels, which is illegal, which is why a federal judge just in the past week has said that the government cannot do this and it needs to stop. We've seen children, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds taken into the custody and care of people who are not child welfare experts. And then of course we see children who are locked up in family detention right now. We see individuals who are locked up during a pandemic. I visited an ICE facility in Farmville, Virginia, just before the shutdown, where 93% of detainees tested positive for COVID because no precautions were undertaken. And this is where, this is not unique, but I do think that what we are seeing is a crisis.
Thank you, Krish. That brings me to another question in terms of the impact of COVID on families. And as well as people that are being detained who lack protection, as well as the folks in the tented areas, and also this taps into the policies that are being changed under the auspices of a COVID response, and so in terms of trying to advance their agenda to keep immigrants from entering our country and hiding behind COVID as some sort of a reason. So can anyone that wants to, including Luis, weigh in on, the impact of COVID? I think, Sister, you can also weigh in on, we can go straight down the line again, but can you talk about what's going on in terms of COVID's impact in Matamoros and obviously in McAllen and our side of the border as well? And then everyone can jump in there. We can go to the same order in terms of Tom, because there are a lot of policies that are being affected by this, as well as Cindy and you. And again, I'd love to hear from Luis if he feels comfortable.
Yes, Antonio, here at the Rio Grande Valley, the communities are very poor, and so because of that, COVID is really hitting hard on many of our families in the U.S. side because they're poor, they don't have insurance, they dare not to go to a hospital, they go too late to get help, and also they are more exposed to jobs because they can't work from home, the kind of jobs they have to be out there with the people. And so we're seeing we're a hot spot here in the Rio Grande Valley as far as the COVID is concerned. It's out of control, and more people are dying than, for example, in Houston that has more cases but less people dying. And part of the reason is the conditions that we have here that our families just don't have to address COVID correctly, and that's unfortunate. But as far as Matamoros and the refugee camp, my God, there's not one person that is sick. We see them all with no symptoms. They carry on life as usual, and thank God, because I don't know if it's because their immune system is so high that they just don't have COVID, or God is protecting them, because if it does spread, they're so together that it would be something that nobody would care for them, because as it is, the city of Matamoros is trying to deal with COVID for their own residents with very limited resources and testing, and so there's no way they can test the people at the refugee camp, so that's what I'm seeing here with respect to COVID.
Great. And Tom, can you weigh in as
Yeah,
well?
I think under any circumstances, a pandemic like COVID-19 would hit these communities hardest because of the reasons Sister Norma has already laid out, because of poverty, because of lack of access to healthcare, because of crowded living conditions, But we exacerbate that by policy when we have policymakers who take advantage of the situation to sow further division in our communities. And they do that by making demarcations of who's entitled to relief support and who's not. And those demarcations are based on people's status, or in the most egregious circumstance, based on the status of someone within your immediate family. And that in and of itself leads to being denied some of the relief that's being accorded. And we exacerbate it when we take practical measures that really make it worse for some of those who already have some of the greatest risk factors. We already know about what it means to be in detention, whether that's criminal detention or ostensibly non-criminal immigration detention. When you're in close quarters, you're at higher risk. When those who are detaining you, whether that's a private company or HHS or DHS, when those who are detaining you are not taking the kinds of steps that are minimally required to prudently address the pandemic, then people are at higher risk. And finally, when we shut down systems that can provide relief or change those systems in a way that further reduces the humanity that's being considered by adjudicators, when we shut down immigration courts, when we say immigration courts can do their work remotely, which we've done even before this pandemic, then the impact is simply to exacerbate what would already occur with a pandemic like this, which is a concentrated, even magnified impact on communities like the refugee and immigrant community writ large.
Cindy? Oh, I'm sorry, Luis, please.
Well, one thing that always comes to mind is awareness. When people don't know what's happening, because right now, unfortunately, the way we're speaking now is literally through devices. The world has shrunken so much because look at this great panel. We're all part of the United States collectively together, but because we live in our own bubbles, we don't acknowledge other things that are going on. So this is where I urge the audience members, if you're living in Matamoros, if you're living in these facilities, you have a phone, record it, make it known. You know, the other day I saw these two little girls that were in front of Taco Bell stealing their Wi-Fi or taking their Wi-Fi to do their homework because they didn't have access to you know, the internet at home because of the given circumstances. But we wouldn't have known if someone didn't post that and took a picture. The power of media is so huge. And if the audience members can just say, look, sometimes we take ourselves for granted, and you'd be surprised how a simple photograph or just you blogging about it or you just bringing attention to it, you never know who may be watching.
Thank you, Luis. Did you want to weigh in, Cindy?
Absolutely. And what I will tell you, Antonio, is that many of our LULAC council leaders and members have been assisting, whether it's local shelters or trying to work with the local community in terms of providing those basic needs. And, you know, for a long time, and I know that Sister Norma can speak to this because she does this work every single day, you know, the issue of food insecurity, the issue of having the basic essentials that we may not necessarily think about. And interestingly enough, I will tell you, Tony, that I think when we look at policies as well, what DHS and ICE have used as an excuse is a lack of having protocols, which is a poor excuse to be able to take action and to make sure that our children are safe. And I think more than that, at this very moment, ICE, DHS can take action in releasing the children and releasing the families today, but they're choosing not to. And so going to, you know, how are we active? How do we make sure that we make the invisible visible? One, we're going to continue as LULAC to push for a congressional hearing. We have had children who have died in the custody and in detention centers. And we also know that there's a lot of money that is being made off of the lives of our children in our community who are being held by private detention centers and by government contractors. And so we really do need to understand the complexity of what immigration has turned to in the US and how it's benefiting, again, that 1% and how that money is going into their pockets. I think as individuals, we also need to make sure that we continue to uplift, to Luis's point, these stories and narratives, and how many of us live or know people who are in El Paso, or who may be in Matamoros, or who may be in a border town along Texas, and make sure that we're uplifting those stories, Tony, because unfortunately, again, this is where we have to force this issue on the media so it again catches traction. Otherwise, it will not be uplifted. It's going to really be up to us to be able to do it.
And that goes back to what Luis was saying too, to make sure that, you know, we're bringing this to light, and sometimes images like his beautiful movie are important. Krish, can you talk about this a little bit too? Because I'm really curious to see how LIRS is dealing, because you guys are direct service providers. You're physically housing people.
Yeah.
How are, in addition to the policy work and the legal work that you do, so how is COVID impacting that part of it, considering you deal a lot with volunteers and people are scared to even get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that in March, April, we did have a dip in terms of the number of volunteers who were willing to help in some of the border work. But honestly, in terms of the foster care parents, the network that we've developed nationally for that takes in unaccompanied children into their own homes, what has been amazing is that there hasn't been a dip at all. In fact, there's a number of people who frankly have opened up their homes precisely because what they're seeing at the southern border, and saying, you know, please convey to the policymakers that we're here, we want to help. You know, we know that there are ways in which we can manage the risk. And that's where, you know, I think it's obvious to all of us on this call that the public health claim has just been used as political cover for what was a pre-existing political agenda. You know, we ourselves are very proud of the fact that, you know, there were a couple of instances of where we did have our children that needed to be tested, or a foster care parent who needed to be tested, but we didn't have a single child who actually tested positive. You know, part of our strategy is to keep them in small homes, as opposed to, you know, what Cindy was alluding to in terms of these for-profit companies that are essentially warehousing children and individuals in these large facilities, trying to make money off them. Our point is that you can absolutely create a system where we have porch check-ins instead of in-person check-ins, or we do virtual case management when we're trying to provide trauma-informed care, when we have the constraint, you know, knowing the pandemic. This is why public health experts have written letters to the administration saying there are absolutely ways in which we can, you know, take precautionary measures. But this is where, you know, even in the last week, you can see how clear a lie this has been. There was a draft order that just came to light in the last 24 hours where the administration is actually considering an executive order that would prevent children on the southern border who come from 4 countries from being expelled, because in August we knew that the US government has agreements with 10 countries where we could only expel the children if they tested negative. Meaning that we were actually testing, guaranteeing that they did not have COVID-19, and then we would expel them. And that is the hypocrisy of the claims that we're hearing. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is, I believe, a measure so that the administration can try to, you know, create a cover so that this restriction won't be struck down as illegal. And that's where, you know, it's a cat and mouse game with this administration. But unfortunately, we're seeing it across immigration policies. With refugee resettlement, there was a restriction in the early months of the pandemic. Fortunately, that has been lifted, and so we are hopeful. But, you know, even when you think about the naturalization hearings, we do so many things virtually. The fact that we're not allowing those naturalization hearings to also proceed virtually, so that these individuals who have gone through so many hoops and are so close to voting, that they are being, I won't use the word disenfranchised because they didn't have the right in the first place, but that is essentially what is happening with hundreds of thousands of individuals.
That is creative voter suppression when it gets to that level. That is remarkable. Thank you, Krish. You always bring so much knowledge and perspective to this. So I'm actually curious about this too, because I still, people that knew that I was involved with these issues, you know, working with all of you at one point or another, they still ask, are they still separating families? You know, what is the status? So can you guys give us, what is the current status of those families who were separated? and the national uproar from 2 years ago, and are they still being separated? And I always like to ask, when we talk about separated families, when all of that was, when it was on the national consciousness, and when you had Laura Bush and others that were coming out on the right side of the angels on that, I always like to add TPS too, temporary protective status, because in terms of families being separated, they're separated years and years later by people being sent back to Nicaragua and other Central American countries, as well as Africa and Asia and others, which is what prompted the statement about shithole countries when he was lamenting not getting more people from Scandinavia coming to this country. So this is for anyone that wants to just pop up and talk about this current status of those separated children. I know Sister worked directly with those families. I know, Chris, you were involved with that. Cindy went down to the border. Tom is dealing with this, and Luis obviously is portraying them. So I want to keep that open to everyone.
Antonio, I would like to respond to that, just to share what I am seeing here at the border. And it's a separation of families in a new perspective. Families that are desperate are sending their children by themselves, crossing the river so that they could get into the United States and go to their families, to their mothers or family members. And what immigration is doing in many cases is actually taking those kids and deporting them, completely sending them off and not communicating them to their families here that are at the refugee camp, And so we heard of one of those childs that was actually deported. He was 15 years old and he was killed in El Salvador, and we heard about it. And so this is happening presently right now. And many of those kids, maybe the government of Mexico, DIF, takes them and puts them in some kind of detention facility that they have, and don't even communicate with their family, that they know their mom is there at the camp,
Anyone else want to weigh in?
I'd just like to emphasize what Sister Norma talked about. We have engaged in coerced family separation for a long, long time in this country, and we still do it. And in my mind, there's not much difference between the kind of forced paramilitary border patrol separating families that we saw during that moment you described, when the country focused, perhaps for the first time, on this issue. But there's not much difference between that and coercing families to have to make the choice on their own to separate. And we still do it. We've always done it. And the other way it happens is even to U.S. citizen kids, because when we deport parents who have U.S. citizen kids, they face a choice. And that choice is, do you separate your family and leave the U.S. citizen kids who have the right to stay in this country while the parent is deported? That's a terrible choice. And the other choice is that you take these U.S.-born kids out of a country that is the only country they've known. And that's the kind of coerced family separation that on an ongoing basis we've engaged in through our laws in this country. So the bottom line answer is, it's still, whether coerced or forced, we are still, through our laws, creating so many separated families. And this is in a country that purports to prioritize the family and family unification and family rights above all.
And Tony, if I can just add one other perspective, when you think about family detention right now, there's an ongoing case because we have 120 children who are with their parents in violation of the Flores settlement, which restricts the amount of time that a child can be in detention. But the issue here is ICE refuses to allow the children and the parents to be released. And so the parents are facing an impossible choice. Either they illegally keep their children in detention so that they can keep the family unit whole, or they are forced to release the child and separate from their child in order to avoid the child being in detention, obviously during a pandemic. And ICE continues to maintain that these are the only two alternatives when we know that there are the alternatives to detention or family case management, where we're involved with this, other nonprofits are involved with this, where we can actually provide community-based services to the family. We can guarantee compliance with immigration law. There's no kind of concern there, we can make sure that the family is receiving the support that they need. And frankly, for conservatives who are talking about the cost of it, it's at a fraction of the cost. And so the idea that we are still forcing family separation on our border today, you know, specifically in Texas, highlights the fact that this issue is still very real.
Cindy, did you want to weigh in, or Luis?
No, I think, Tony, I think that Tom, Christian, and Sister Norma have laid it out beautifully. And I would just say for folks, you know, who are looking for something immediately to do, one, support Sister Norma. She does this every single day. And certainly I know that, you know, behind the scenes, there is organizations are coming together in terms of how do we, again, you know, bring this issue into the spotlight to make sure that there's more responses, right? So absolutely, I saw in the chat box, use the hashtag Free Our Children. And again, I think part of our own unique roles is making sure that we understand that long history, as mentioned by Tom, in terms of how the U.S. government has sanctioned these, you know, this coercion of separating children and families. And absolutely, as I mentioned, Tony, ICE at this very moment can release the children and the families. We understand why they have not done it. We know there's a Stephen Miller in the White House. We know there's a President Trump, and we know that there's an election that's coming up. And so for the folks, you know, that are on the sideline in terms of you're voting, you're not voting, there's no question. If you're eligible to vote, vote.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to add the same thing as Cindy, you know, it's, you have to vote. You do matter. And every little grano de sal, you know, does add up. So please, I urge you to support every single person from this organization, you know, the panelists. They're championing this and they need your support. Even if it's just say an acknowledgement, I see you, that goes a long way.
And we'll be having a charla on voting, several of them before the election. So we'll make sure to let you guys know. So since Cindy brought up action, which she always brings up action, and you are bringing up action as well, Luis, anyone else want to weigh in on actions we can take? Sister, I know that supporting you is an easy action to take, but also I see the hashtag going around, you know, how can we raise that visibility? I know during the Hispanic Heritage Awards that we're doing on October 6th, we're working with Catholic Relief Services on a beautiful video to keep this issue on the forefront in terms of our community's priorities and our country's priorities. So anyone else want to weigh in? And I'm going to go to the audience for a couple of questions.
So Antonio, very quickly, all I would say is we need to recognize that voting is not something you do once every 2 years or every 4 years. That really you are voting every day with the awareness that you bring to an issue, like this beautiful film, Mirage. Bringing awareness to that is a vote in favor of change to the situation that we have. We have to remember that no matter the outcome in November, we have to continue to demand that not just the policies of this administration be reversed, but that we review the ongoing decades-long flaws in our immigration policy and not forget that we deprive children of due process every day by not giving them representation in immigration court. Not forgetting that we have an immigration system that punishes countries in the Americas in comparison to those in other parts of the world. Not forgetting that there is no excuse for detention of folks who are not guilty of any crime under our laws. So we have to continue to vote every day, not just on election day, or if you choose to vote early before election day, but keep voting in different ways throughout the year.
And I know that you're dealing with that. Actually, Tom, can you spend a minute, because we're going to be done in 10 minutes, so I'm going to ask just a couple of audience questions. But I think this is a good time to talk about another battle that you fight, which is on issues of voter suppression, especially right now that you're dealing with the post office and whether it's a legitimate vote if you vote online, through the mail. Can you talk about that for just a couple of minutes?
Sure. The problem in this country with respect to the vote is we do not have a U.S. Constitution guaranteed right to vote. We have rights not to be discriminated against in the vote, but because we don't have a U.S. Constitution-based right to vote, states differ in the policies that they provide. So some states are very good about recognizing that the pandemic means you have to make remote voting widely available without having to have a reason. Just fear should be enough to allow people to vote by mail. You have to make sure that it's not just having to use the US Postal Service given the understandable lack of confidence in it, but that there are secure voter ballot drop boxes available before the election. And for those who feel the need or the desire to vote in person, despite the pandemic, we have to make voting widely available early so that there won't be crowded polling places on election day, which is dangerous under our current public health guidelines, but making sure that over 10 days, over 2 weeks, people can vote ahead of time and not crowd any single polling place. But that's going to differ state to state. I sit in a state, California, that's very good on these issues, but MALDEF was founded in a state, Texas, that's not very good on these issues at all. So what we really need long-term is uniform practices, uniform guarantees that make the right to vote real for everyone, that make the practice of voting real for everyone. But in the meantime, you're right, we've got to fight against every means of suppression. You heard about one where potential new citizens are being barred from voting in November because of what's happening with respect to naturalization. But we know there's even more direct efforts to purge people from the votes, often just as that last indirect means of suppressing the vote, targeting naturalized voters. We've seen purges attempted in Texas that target naturalized voters. And we see other measures designed like voter ID, like new requirements for voter registration that are designed to deter and suppress the vote. We've got to universally, as a country, guarantee across the board a real and effective vote.
Thank you. And so we have some questions from the audience, and we could probably only get to 2, but I'm going to put this one to Cindy and anyone else that wants to jump in. But it me suena como Cindy when it was asked. So from Yadira Santana Dowling, how can we put collective pressure so that immigration reform is a top issue during this election and a priority for a potential new government?
Well, I think, for one, we need to make sure that we're bringing up this issue as a priority issue. And we understand we're living through a pandemic, a global pandemic at that, where 5 out of 6 Latinos have to leave their houses every single day here in the US, where we are disproportionately unemployed because we're in sectors where we have experienced a direct impact, where we are overrepresented as the essential workers, even when we don't have the essential protections like our farm workers and our meat packing workers, where we literally are making sure that American families have fruits and vegetables and meat on their table. And so what I would say, I think, one, we need to make sure that to pressure Congress to have a bill that protects our children, and also pass the HEROES Act, right? I mean, like, I know, unfortunately, the CARES Act left out mixed status families. It left out the most vulnerable in our communities. And right now, the proposals that are on the table, unfortunately, benefit the 1%, benefit the rich who are already rich. And so I think on our end, it's making sure that we are taking care of each other, because unfortunately, we have seen that under this administration, that's not going to happen for communities of color. I would say, secondly, Antonio, make sure that we're, thinking creatively about national campaigns to uplift, and maybe it's Free Our Children, or, Children Out of Cages. I think it's really thinking not only about the immediate changes, but also the long-term changes, understanding that systemic institutional racism is a real thing, and that even racism and anti-Blackness within our own community is a real thing. And understanding that each one of us has a role to play in what occurs and happens. And even when we feel como que no podemos ya más, we have to keep going. And Luis, I really do love the part of the film where it's the parents reminding us that we are meant to be, and that we're stronger, right, than in our hardest moments. And I think as a community, we have to remember what we bring every single day, Antonio, every single day, not only to our families, but to this entire country. And although they may not recognize us, we can recognize ourselves and uplift our stories. I do think it's going to have to be grassroots. I don't think this is something that the government is going to do for us. We're going to have to force this issue. And forcing this issue is making sure that it's visible.
Great. So the last question is by Lali Rivera Perez, the question is, what is the criteria to be a foster parent for any of these immigrant children? Which is a beautiful question, because every child should be wanted and cherished by someone. So anyone want to answer that question?
I can start, and then obviously welcome anyone else jumping in. It is really just that you be willing to take this child in as your own. You know, LIRS's philosophy is that these children are not just in our custody, but that they're in our care. And our hope is that we can provide every single one of them for what we would want for our own child, for our own niece or nephew. And that's really just a safe, small, family-centric home. If you go to the www.lirs.org website, you'll see a tab that says, how do you become a foster care parent? And you can just click on that. And then if you have any additional questions, please feel free to send me a note, which is just my first initial and then last name, which is not easy, I'm sorry. But kvignoraja@lirs.org, and I'd be happy to answer them myself or make sure a staff follows up. But this is how we show the government that sometimes claims, oh, you can't take in all of these children, so instead we need to have, you know, these for-profit companies that are literally reaping in billions of dollars. And we know we can. We know that we have the humanity and the love in us to show who we are. Sometimes people will try to change us, but that's where the foster care program is something that I am really so proud of, and really appreciate the question.
Great. Okay, I want to thank everyone for being on this Charla. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Cindy, Omaira, Luis, Krish, Cindy. I said Cindy twice. Tom, Sister Norma, and all of you that are participating. Keep speaking up, standing up, and showing up to help the most vulnerable in our community. Stay tuned for our next Charla, but this was fantastic. And again, Luis, thank you for this beautiful film and for what you're doing to tell our stories, as well as, like I said, all the other panelists and friends for continuing their work on behalf of the most vulnerable in our community, and continue to shine a light because it's important. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.